The concluding part of the story is next Sunday evening at 9:05. Robert De Niro and Robert Duvall are the stars of this week's Great American Picture Show over on BBC2 in a couple of minutes. True Confessions. Here on 1 in 15 minutes, Heart of the Matter examines the role of today's pacifists and conscientious objectors. That's after the news with Jan Leeming at 10:20.
Labour in Blackpool, a compromise on nuclear power, but a row about tax. The yachtsman who cheated death talks of his 10-day ordeal. A vicious race attack, police hunt a gang of youths. And the Russians let the West into a nuclear secret. At the opening of the Labour conference at Blackpool, the party executive have managed to avoid a clash over nuclear power. The miners' union had said that nuclear power stations must be immediately phased out. Neil Kinnock said it would take around 20 years. The final motion now makes no reference to a timescale, but there is disagreement over taxation. A leading member of the National Executive believes Labour's plans will mean higher taxes for more people than just the very rich.
That nuclear power should be phased out isn't at issue. What is the timescale. Mr. Kinnock and the party leadership say it will probably take 20 years. But Arthur Scargill and others say it could be done more quickly. And the miners' leader was clearly pleased that the executive had decided to back his tougher motion, calling on the next Labour government to halt the nuclear power programme.
Well, I'm delighted. It's a complete victory for the anti-nuclear cause. I think they've done their sums, recognised it was a foregone conclusion, and I'm very, very pleased that they're now going to support an anti-nuclear motion which will take us towards the next general election and victory.
But even Mr. Scargill recognises that a complete shutdown might take at least 9 years. And the executive have made clear they're only supporting the miners' resolution on the understanding that it doesn't commit them to closing all nuclear power stations within the first 5 years of a Labour government.
I suppose it is feasible not to take power from nuclear power stations within 5 years. What is not feasible is to get the adequate transfer to uses of other forms of energy in that period, and it is not feasible to generate the alternative jobs within that period in the energy industries.
A compromise then on nuclear power. But the leadership's been embarrassed over the sensitive issue of Labour's taxation plans. A member of the broad left on the National Executive has said Labour's programme can't be implemented without increasing direct taxation. David Blunkett told a fringe meeting it would be dishonest to tell people that Labour would only tax the top 5%.
You can't sustain a credible drive for socialism that people will believe if you only say you will increase taxation for those over 28 or 30,000 a year income. In my view, there will have to be a return to a higher, because it is a return to a higher standard rate of income tax, and people will respect us for saying so.
Roy Hattersley's immediate response was that that might be Mr. Blunkett's view, but it wasn't Labour Party policy. And, said Labour's Shadow Chancellor, it wasn't his view of what was necessary. Defeat for the platform, though, at the first conference session tonight. In the very first card vote, delegates agreed that the next Labour government should include a ministry for women and that minister should be in the cabinet.
In Northern Ireland, police say they've thwarted a new bombing campaign by INLA terrorists in County Down. Their success owes much to the heroism of one RUC officer who picked up a live 40-pound bomb planted in the town of Downpatrick and carried it over 80 yards to safety just before it exploded. Later, police found 2 more bombs after 3 cars were challenged at a roadblock.
The constable broke regulations by picking up the 40-pound bomb, but his senior officers say his bravery probably saved lives. He carried it away from the houses where many old people lived to waste ground 100 yards away. 10 minutes later it exploded, smashing dozens of windows but injuring no one.
If that constable had not have acted quickly, there is no doubt we would have had serious injuries, if not deaths, in Downpatrick last evening.
The Protestant-owned pub was to have been the first of 3 targets, but the bomb convoy of 3 cars, with 2 terrorists in each, met a police roadblock. One of the cars sped through, the police firing as it went. 3 men and a woman were taken from the other 2 cars and the area was evacuated. A bomb inside one exploded 4 hours later. The police have searched all day for the 2 men who got away. In an area where 20 officers have been murdered in as many months, the police are desperate to build on any success against the terrorists.
Ron Hughes, the yachtsman who cheated death by surviving 9 days in an open life raft, has been describing his ordeal. He's now recuperating in Oxfordshire.
Ron Hughes is staying with friends, trying to forget his tragic voyage and the wave that sank his boat and killed his wife.
I saw that it began to break at the very wrong time for us, the very worst time. And indeed, when it hit us, it didn't just lift the boat. The breaking crest and the force and sheer steepness of it broke totally into the boat.
Ron praises the efforts of those who searched for him, though he says it's a chance in a million he's still alive.
A ship passed me within half a mile immediately after we capsized and didn't see us. I let off a parachute flare as soon as we capsized. That night, I saw a couple of ships. Let off one flare of one which I thought might see me. This was a handheld flare, and it didn't see me.
As we now know, Ron drifted without food for 9 days. His voyage began in Scotland. The couple were last sighted in port at Falmouth. Shortly afterwards they sank, and no one knew Ron was alive until he was picked up by Spanish fishermen. Ron and Elaine were married just before they sailed. Ron lost everything when the boat went down. Now he desperately wants to visit Elaine's parents in Canada.
I would explain to them why it was that the girl they knew, who was a happy, prominent member of Montreal society, a successful company lawyer, could have found herself in the middle of the Bay of Biscay and drowning in the prime of her life, 33 years old. I feel it's my responsibility to explain to them why that happened and how it happened.
Ron Hughes talking about his ordeal at sea. The pound could come under pressure on the world's foreign exchanges when they open in a few hours' time. It's because in Washington a meeting of finance ministers from the world's leading industrial countries has failed to agree on joint economic action. And it's also led to fears that interest rates in Britain could soon go up.
There's a bitter argument going on behind the scenes here in Washington, and it's one which could push the pound down further and force interest rates up in Britain. On one side stands America, worried by the flood of imports pouring into the country. On the other stand Germany and Japan, bluntly refusing to take the action the Americans want. US Treasury Secretary James Baker wants Germany to cut its interest rates, crank up its economy, and get some of those imports flowing its way. The Germans have rejected this bluntly as being both dangerous and pointless. Britain stands on the sidelines, with Chancellor Nigel Lawson trying to make peace, all too aware that in the absence of agreement, America has threatened to push the dollar down, taking the pound down with it. But the Chancellor was trying to pour cold water on the fears of the markets.
There's been much too much focus on the short term. Quite honestly, whether the interest rates go down half a point or not, and I don't know whether they're going to go down half a point or not, is going to make very, very little difference. It is sticking the policies right and sticking to them. On that, there is a very wide measure of agreement.
The world's money markets wanted a strong signal from Washington that the argument's over. So far, they haven't got one. But in small private meetings between the top finance ministers, the Americans have failed to get their way. The Germans have not agreed to cut interest rates, and that will do little to reduce the tension in the money markets tomorrow.
A small group of Western journalists has been taken on a guided tour of a Soviet nuclear test site. It's the first time the Soviet Union has allowed foreigners to see such a secret installation. The journalists were told that the test site in the Republic of Kazakhstan has not been used since the Soviet Union announced a moratorium on testing nuclear weapons more than a year ago.
The principal Soviet test site is set in the bleak, barren landscape of Central Asia, far from the Soviet frontiers, far from the route of any casual visitor to an obsessively secret country. This group of reporters are the first Westerners ever known to have visited it. They were taken to the mouth of a tunnel dug not down, but into the side of granite hills. General Ilyenko, who accompanied the party, said each tunnel was used only once. He took the group about 100 yards in along the railway track towards the center of the mountain. Work on this tunnel, he said, had been stopped when the Soviet moratorium was declared last August, and it would take another 6 months before it could be used. The general left no doubt about the purpose of the visit. It was to increase pressure on the United States to follow the Soviet lead and stop testing nuclear weapons. The party were also taken to see a group of private American scientists who are being allowed to install sensitive seismic equipment at 3 sites around the test zone. They confirmed that they have detected no tests in the region, but point out it would take a much more substantial network to monitor the whole of the Soviet Union's huge landmass.
Tonight in Washington, the American Secretary of State, Mr. George Shultz, is to have another unexpected meeting with his Soviet counterpart, Mr. Shevardnadze. It's thought they could be discussing the case of Nicholas Danilov, the imprisoned American journalist, and that a solution could be close. In South Africa, the Zulu leader, Chief Buthelezi, has warned his more militant opponents that he and his supporters will not be frightened off by violence. He was addressing an annual rally outside Durban in memory of Shaka, the founder of the old Zulu Empire.
Chief Buthelez's Zulus swept into Claremont Township today for a traditional tribute to their nation's founder and an equally traditional show of force. This is enemy territory for Buthelezi, a township of radical Zulus who regard him as a sellout. He brought his homeland troops to demonstrate and protect his power. The rift amongst blacks here has already led to many killings, and there'll be more threats of violence today. But Buthelez's long motorcade came down from the KwaZulu capital, and his enemies stayed away. This hereditary Zulu leader stands defiantly now in a no-man's land between government and ANC.
We were not cowards. If destiny calls upon us tomorrow to fight and die, we will do so. We will not be turned into political slaves, even by burning tires. Isn't it so?
Chief Buthelezi preaches non-violence, but the undeclared war between his supporters and the township radicals looks set to get worse. He also warned the government there would have to be changes soon. If his Zulus dropped non-violence, he said, the consequences would be a nightmare.
2 young black men are seriously ill in hospital in London, and a third has facial wounds after a race attack by a gang of 40 white youths. Police described it as unprovoked and concerted.
It's not an area noted for racial friction, more an ordinary London suburb than an inner-city ghetto. But the police are certain that last night's attacks were racially motivated. A trail of bloodstains marked the spot where 2 young black men were set upon by up to 40 white youths as they left a disco. One victim is tonight under intensive care with severe chest and lung stab wounds. The other is stable after being stabbed in the stomach. Half an hour after the first assault, as police guarded the hall, a third youth was attacked nearby by the same gang. Adrian Bennett, a 17-year-old student, was walking towards a taxi rank with friends when he was slashed in the face and neck. The mob shouted racial abuse at him.
when I was kicked and punched, I was told by the youths that kicked and punched me that 40 black people had surrounded a couple of white youths, you see. So in doing this, they just went after any black person. We were the unfortunate ones. Well, I was.
Well, it was a very serious attack, both in the nature, the severity of the injuries, and the nature of the attack. The fact that it was a completely unprovoked attack on innocent people making their way home.
Although police have gathered some evidence, including blood-stained clothing from one of the victims, at the Mitcham Special Incident Room, detectives are appealing for more witnesses to come forward to help identify members of the gang.
The boxer Lloyd Honeyghan has been celebrating his remarkable win over the American Don Curry. It means that Honeyghan, a Londoner, is the new undisputed welterweight champion of the world. Curry had successfully defended his title 7 times before. Both men had never lost a bout. The fight in Atlantic City was stopped after the 6th round when Curry's eye was badly gashed. Desmond Lynham was commentating for BBC Radio.
We have an absolute sensation. Curry is stopped at the end of the 6th round with a cut eye. He was behind on points. Lloyd Honeyghan from Britain via Jamaica is the new undisputed welterweight champion of the world, and don't say he didn't deserve it because he won 4 of the 6 rounds we saw.
After the fight, Honeyghan said, "I told everyone I was better than Curry. Now I've shown them all." In Cornwall, the week-long World Surfing Championships reached their climax with an exciting battle between the United States and Australia. 250 surfers from 18 countries took part, many of them praising the good size of the waves. But there was disappointment for the 15-year-old Australian Nicky Wood. Tipped to win both junior and senior competitions, he only managed to come second in the junior event. His 19-year-old teammate, Mark Sainsbury, eventually won the Open Championship, and Australia took 3 out of 4 first prizes. But Britain's surfers weren't disgraced. They finished 8th in the team event. That's all from me for this weekend. Good night.
It's been a fine day over eastern Britain and over much of Europe as well, but it's never good everywhere. Rain over Scotland, thunderstorms over Italy, and some real crackers over Croatia. But the records today, they were in eastern Britain. Finningley is near Doncaster. The prize for effort today, by the way, Aberdeen, 22 Celsius, 72 Fahrenheit. But there are still fronts giving rain over North and West Scotland, and they will be there for some days to come, as will this high pressure giving fine weather in the south and east. But it's cloudy everywhere at the moment. Some drizzle in the west, some rain in the north, and patches of quite thick fog forming in the south. Mild everywhere, 12 is the lowest, 54 Fahrenheit. Tomorrow, a dull, misty start for many of us, with further rain in the north and west there and drizzle elsewhere. But as we go through the day, over central and eastern parts of Britain, the cloud thinning and breaking to give spells of warm sunshine yet again. Still cloudy near these west coasts with spots of drizzle, and still some rain over north and west Scotland. Temperatures like today's, 21 Celsius, at least in the east, is 70 Fahrenheit. Cooler, 15 is 59 in the west. Much less cool, much cloudier, much duller there, but a nice day for most of it. Finally, a summary of tomorrow's weather. There we are. May I wish you a very good night.
Now, with news of tomorrow night's Panorama, here's Fred Emery.
As nuclear defence stirs up a political storm, Labour believe they have a winner. Beef up conventional forces, but get rid of the bomb. In Panorama, Neil Kinnock says he'll die for his country, but he won't take everyone else with him.
I am not prepared to obliterate not just the continent, not just an army, but to wipe out the possible means of life for generations to come.
From the home of the Navy's Polaris fleet on the west coast of Scotland, we look at the consequences, military as well as political, of scrapping Britain's independent nuclear deterrent. And if Labour asks the Americans to remove their nuclear weapons too, where will that leave us with NATO? And what of the US response?
Any removal of the nuclear weapons from Britain would constitute an invitation to a power that had nuclear weapons to attack.
That's Disarm and Defend. Panorama tomorrow night at 9:30.
And now on BBC One, this week's Heart of the Matter examined the role of a pacifist in today's world where there is the ever-present threat of a nuclear war.
In the last two world wars, conscientious objectors had a legal right to be excused from fighting. They had to convince a board that they believed that war was morally wrong. Well, today, in peacetime, there are still conscientious objectors. They argue that in a nuclear war, there wouldn't be time to object, so they must protest now. They object to their taxes being used to fund the military machine and try instead to redirect them to peaceful purposes. In doing so, they've risked the full wrath of the law and have often paid the price.